We are Navy brats. We're the daughters of Robert Lee Donley, who was in the Navy for 21 years. He was at Sandpoint during World War II. He was from Wisconsin. He graduated from a small college called Ripon in Wisconsin, and he got a fellowship to teach at the University of Washington in the physics department. For whatever reason, in 1939, he decided to leave that fellowship and join the Navy. So his first little document is as a seaman first class, which apparently was just a formality. But he has always told us he joined the Navy because he wanted to fly. So the first thing that happened was he applied for flight school, and they sent him to Pensacola, Florida. But after he was done with flight school, he came back, and this was prior to Pearl Harbor, but the United States was aware of Japanese activity in the Aleutians. So Sandpoint was a chief station for the big PBY flying boats. As for apparently for some bureaucratic reason, the Navy wasn't allowed to have land-based planes at that time. So they had to have planes that could land on the water, and originally were tended by seaplane tenders, and then later had some beaching gear added to them so that the men could actually bring them on the beach themselves. So my dad was trained to fly these PBYs, and his first deployment to Alaska was in VP-42. The little button, the seal with the bomb on its nose, that is from VP-42. And that squadron was reformed from VP-17 that had been in place for reconnaissance prior to that. And Admiral Russell joined the squadron as commanding officer, and he became a longtime family friend of ours. We called him the Admiral. And so these men were the first to be sent up to establish bases along the route between Sandpoint and Cold Bay and Dutch Harbor at that particular time. And this was prior to the Japanese bombing of Dutch Harbor. So my father was up there flying missions to find the planes. The PBYs were sent out to find the enemy and report it to the Army, which was also stationed at Cold Bay at what's called Fort Mears. So they were flying missions at the time that Dutch Harbor was bombed by the Japanese. And he has a number of orders in here that are marked Sandpoint, and I can show you those later, but and signed by Admiral Russell and Gearis and other dignitaries that went down in history. But that time he has made some comments to some of the people who've tried to document it about how difficult it was flying up there in the fog, without trying to not be seen by the enemy, but also flying low enough to see the enemy. And these planes were very big, and they weren't meant to be doing bombing, but they did if they found the enemy. And that mission was, I think it was called Russell's Rascals. They were all kind of scrappy young men. My dad was probably about 23 years old. And they lived through the bombing of Dutch Harbor. VP-42 had a few casualties, but in general they drove the Japanese off. But after Dutch Harbor, they didn't issue any other orders in writing. They were kept a secret.
Wow.
And so the flight is very long out to Dutch Harbor, and then even further out to Attu, because his next squadron, he came back to Sandpoint, regrouped, and then became commander of VP-45, which trained more young men to go back to the Aleutians to fight the Japanese who had occupied Kiska and Attu. Sandpoint was just the fact that he was flying the planes out of there. Of course, in later years, we went to Sandpoint to go to the Navy Exchange after he came back here, and it figured in our history, but it was mostly his very young life. I think the significant thing was that all these young men accomplished these incredible feats flying out of Sandpoint, and it was, their home base and where they came back to.
This was what he wrote to this reunion in 1997, and I'll just read a little. The formation of VP 45 began in the late February of 1943, when I and Will Joe Lindgren were called into the Commander Fleet Air at Sandpoint, Seattle, and directed to form a squadron of 6 PBYs to be known as VP 45. We were to train crews for a mission, the purpose and destination of which we were not told. The Admiral said he would call us back to Seattle when the mission was finished and give us a duty assignment of our choosing. We received our planes direct from Consolidated and were given priority for anything we needed. On the 2nd of April, I received orders to report to Commander Fleet Air Seattle, who gave me orders to report to VP 45 as commanding officer. It should be noted that the squadron was not commissioned at this point. On the 25th of April, the squadron left Seattle for Adak, with stops at Kodiak and Dutch Harbor. We arrived at Adak on the 2nd of May, landing in Andrews Lagoon. We stayed at the lagoon waiting orders until the 13th of May, when we were ordered to fly to Attu and report to the commander of Task Force 6. Until that time, we didn't know what our mission was. The weather was bad at Attu, and the task force was under radio silence, so we set up a patrol as best we could. When our fuel ran low, we were able to raise the task force commander, and were told to go to a small cove south of the invasion landing area. There we found the USS Casco, after which the cove was later named. Our job at the time was to cover the task force for anti-submarine patrols during the period of the battle. In addition to providing anti-submarine coverage and being the only airborne support group at Attu, we were used to transport Army commanders to different places on the island for scouting and even to drop surrender leaflets at the enemy. On one occasion, I took several Army officers to Chichagof Harbor after the area was secure. After landing, we took a life raft ashore. I will never forget the scene we encountered. The soldiers were cleaning up the area and making a pile of the dead Japanese. The pile was about 6 feet high, and the stench was terrible. I talked to a soldier, and these are the American soldiers, who had a bullet hole through his helmet. It missed his head, and he seemed to be happy. When we dropped surrender leaflets on the Japanese, we had to have reasonably clear weather, as we needed to climb high over the mountains and then drop down across the enemy areas toward the water. As the battle continued, we established patrols to the west of Attu. During these patrols, we would occasionally pick up flights of Bettys. Do you know what a Betty is?
Japanese plane.
Japanese plane, on the way to make bombing runs on Attu. We would send messengers of their positions to the command via the cruisers OS-2U float planes that were patrolling the island. The P-38s stationed at Amchitka would then be alerted to meet the Bettys, and from what I heard, they had a number of kills. Our squadron suffered no casualties. Occasionally, we would take a bullet through the hull, which we would patch with rubber C-plugs. True to his word, early in June, when the battle for Attu was finally over, Confer Seattle ordered Lindgren and I back to Seattle. That's when he met my mother and was married. Now, I know that there were... You want me to read the next part here? Okay. However, when I arrived in Seattle, I found that VP 45 was being made a 12-plane squadron under the command of Lieutenant Commander Carl Ame. Ame, A-M-M-E. Ame had requested I stay on as the executive officer. Admiral Wagner was no longer Confer Seattle, so I didn't get a duty assignment of my choosing. Oh, you're right. He wasn't done.
Yeah.
On July 8th, 1943, I was back at Casco Cove, and we had a 12-plane squadron of PBY-5s. Shortly after arriving at Casco Cove, Ame led a 3-plane night flight, Carpenter and Earhart were the pilots of the other 2 PBYs, to bomb Paramushiro. The entire area was shrouded by overcast, so bombs were dropped when they estimated they were on the island. No enemy fire was encountered. We lived on the seaplanes and on the tender until the Seabees completed living facilities and a radio shack on Attu. We moved ashore the end of July. Near the Quonset huts, there was a small stream that contained salmon and Dolly Varden trout, which one could catch in their hands. We built a barbecue pit in the cliff next to the huts and found fish, a wonderful change of diet from the usual military mess and K rations. We continued patrolling to the west and to the north as far as Kamchatka. We also provided ASW coverage for the invasion of Kishka. By October, our runway was completed, and it was time for the squadron to return to our waterlogged planes back to Seattle. The squadron went on a well-deserved leave. It was then that I finally left the squadron for an assignment at NAS Jacksonville. Then I got married to a wonderful lady named Marjorie, who has been my wife for 54 years. I understand that eventually the squadron reformed and went to South America, and that's how I remember it. Bellevue, Washington, April 1997.
My dad did go to Jacksonville, Florida to teach flying there, and then was stationed in Oklahoma. Not sure why, but this was just as the war in Europe ended, and I was born on February 3rd, 1945 in Shawnee, Oklahoma.
And then he stayed in the military but was sent to MIT graduate school in Boston, Massachusetts, and I was born near Boston in 1947.
Mm-hmm. When he retired, he had 21 years in the Navy, and at MIT he received an electrical engineering degree. They promised him he could do TV research, which didn't work out. So they sent him to the Philippines, and then he had to do duty in Korea, and so then he stayed in, for 21 years. But his last job was Chief of Stockpile Operations Branch of the Joint Armed Forces Base in Sandia in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he retired there and then went to work in the military-industrial complex at Boeing. And that's how we got here.
Developing the Minuteman missile. He was working on.
Really, while we were growing up, he didn't talk about any of this, and all of his assignments were secret, and so it just took, he did save a lot of things, so I was able to piece it together, and I was able to talk to him a little bit at the end of his life about the pictures that we had, but it took a little bit of piecing the whole thing together, because when you're kids, you don't quite link things up in order properly. Yeah. And by the way, when I was in college, I met a Navy ROTC guy and fell in love with him, and we got engaged, and our rehearsal dinner was in the Officers Club at Sandpoint.